Hi there. This is part 2 of the Textures and Composition project for Art 120 illustration. So today we're going to be working in Illustrator and applying some textures in Illustrator similar to how we did in Photoshop, but dealing with vector artwork instead of rasterized artwork, which is the difference between Illustrator and Photoshop. So if you're unfamiliar with that, you can look into it a little bit more, but essentially in Photoshop, just like a regular photo, things are pixelized. They're using pixels to create the image that we're seeing. And you can only go so big with something that is pixelized before it starts to look distorted. You probably know this from looking at photos online. If you try to stretch it and get too big, it starts to look fuzzy and unclear. Where in Illustrator, we're working with vector artwork, which always will keep the clean lines that you've created, and you can expand them and contract them in any sort of size. It could be as small as a penny or as large as the size of a side of a building, and it will hold on to that clean aesthetic that it has without looking pixelized at all. So today we're going to look at working with a different composition that you've created. Your second composition, we worked with the first one in Photoshop. So what I'd like for you to do is repeat the steps for your second composition in Photoshop, adjusting the levels and saving that out as a PSD file so that you have a nice white background and some nice dark lines for your artwork. What we're looking for is contrast in there. You want the lines to be very dark and the paper to be very white. So if you need to refer back to the previous videos on how to do that, you can do so. But at this point, we're going to go ahead and open up our second file that I've already created. I'm actually going to be working off of the same file, but we're going to open this one up in Illustrator and we'll take it from there. So the first thing I want to do is open up Illustrator. And I provided you with these textures on Edmodo that I want you to download that we're going to use for today's practice. You can find a lot of free textures online, and these are going to be just a small example of what we're going to use for today's practice. But these are vectorized textures that were free, and we can utilize those for our artwork today. So within Illustrator, let's go ahead and open up your textures if you haven't already, so you have that pulled up. Download that from Edmodo and open it up. And then we're also going to open up our composition Photoshop file that we've already adjusted the levels on. So I'm going to go to File, Open, and find that composition artwork that I've already adjusted in Photoshop and open it up here in Illustrator. And it's going to give you a Photoshop import option, something like this. For this particular practice, we're just going to go to flatten layers to a single image to keep it nice and small. And I'm going to hit Command 0 here to see my full page. You should see something like this. So very similar to what we saw in Photoshop. It's still pixelized, right? So if we zoom in really close, we can see that these pixels are just what's creating this image. So if we were to scale this up very large, we would see some of this pixelization that's happening within this artwork. So the goal today is to create vectorized artwork out of this. So there's several ways to go about this. Obviously, you could use the pen tool to trace out these different shapes, which a lot of times is going to be what you're going to do. It's going to give you a much cleaner look. It's going to give you much fewer anchor points and make your file smaller and also the artwork just cleaner. But you can also do image trace options, and I don't encourage you to do this all the time by any means, but image trace can be a helpful tool, especially when we're dealing with illustrations or inkings that we're bringing into Illustrator. So what we're looking for here is, again, some nice contrast, some nice thick lines to our artwork, and we want things to be closed off. So in this particular case, all of my shapes are closed off. There's no gaps in any of my shapes. So if that's the case, it'd be helpful to fix that in Photoshop with your brush tool and then bring it back into Illustrator so that all of your shapes are closed off so that this will work properly. So the first thing that we need to do is use our arrow tool to select the artwork. And we're going to actually go ahead and come up here to the very top and go to Image Trace. and it's going to tell us that it's going to go slowly. That's fine. We're going to click OK. Excuse me, I'm still sick, guys, working through this. So it's gone ahead and given us a default here, a default image trace. So it's already vectorizing this artwork for us. We can see if we zoom in now, we've lost all that pixelization. It's created vector artwork. And the cleaner your artwork is, the better that vectorization is going to work for this. The thicker the lines, the more contrast you have, it's going to work much better. So, but for this particular practice, we're actually going to adjust this a little bit further. So if you're not seeing the dialog box to adjust this further, if you come up to the top bar, you'll see image trace panel is up here. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that, and it should bring up my image trace options. I believe you can also find that in window image trace if you need to bring that up a different way. So within this dialog box here, we have some additional choices that we can sort of adjust to our live trace here. So threshold is going to be how much of that black that it actually picks up. Paths is going to be how closely it follows the actual paths that are called out. Corners is going to be how sharp the corners are, more or less, and actual noise within the illustration as well. So let's go ahead and let's maybe bump up our threshold ever so slightly. And every time we do this, it's going to kind of change the progress here as long as we have the preview toggled on. And I'm going to actually bring up my paths to about 80% as well. And then I'm going to bring down my corners to maybe 4%. I like to have smoother corners on mine. And then for my noise, I'm actually going to bring that down a little bit as well, maybe 5 or 6 pixels. So you should have something like this now. Things are a little bit tighter. There's hopefully not quite as many anchor points. Things are pretty smooth and following the lines that you want to follow. So that's looking pretty good. We want to make sure that the mode is in black and white. That should be the default, so we shouldn't have to worry about that. And then you can also ignore the white and just have the black lines if you toggle off this ignore white option here, which can be helpful at times as well. But for today's practice, we're actually going to keep the white shapes within those because we're going to change the colors. So once we're happy with this, we can come back up here and click the expand button. And as we can see, I'm going to go ahead and close my image trace window. It's gone ahead and expanded this, and now instead of being pixelized artwork, this is actually vectorized artwork with several different anchor points. We can always use our direct selection arrow if we needed to change any of those anchor points accordingly. We have not only the black lines, but we also have the individual lines, shapes within these are still called out as white. So right now, if I'm using my selection arrow and I click on here, it's going to select the whole thing because it's grouped together. So we can actually come up here to Object, Ungroup, and hopefully start to break apart some of these shapes a little bit differently. So now that we've ungrouped this whole deal, we can actually change the colors of these independent shapes, very similar to how we did in Photoshop. But you'll probably notice if you select on this that it's still in a grayscale here. If you open up your colors palette, each one of these individual shapes is still in grayscale. It's only white and black right now. So you can click on the top right up here and adjust that to CMYK and use the sliders to choose any color that you would like for these individual shapes. And we can also use the Pantone color system to start assigning these shapes. Now, your Pantone color system is going to be what we use here in the industry to create a universal color matching system. And it's used to create color consistency across a wide variety of platforms, materials, and uses. So PMS stands for Pantone Matching System. And really what it is it's a way for me to assign some colors to some sort of artwork and for the printers to have some sort of standardized way to match that color appropriately. So if I come over here to my actual artwork, I can go into, I'm going to go ahead and close this right now. If I come back into my swatches palette and I come up to my top right option, so if you're not seeing your swatches, make sure that your swatches are open in your window. If I come up here to the little hamburger up at the top right, you'll see if I slide down to Open Swatch Library, I can come over to Color Books, excuse me, And then I have several Pantone color books that I can refer to. One of the most common ones is solid coated, meaning that it has a solid color and it's some sort of coated paper. The second most common is probably uncoated paper. But let's go ahead and stick with solid coated for right now. So again, that's found under your swatches, open swatch library, color books, and Pantone solid color coated. So I'm going to go ahead and again open up this window that I already had here, and you can see here that it has a wide variety of colors for me to choose from, different hues and values of those hues. And again, each one of these colors is very specific to the Pantone matching system, and if I designate one of these shapes to be a specific PMS color, if I open back up my color up here, I can see that this specific Pantone color is Pantone 7712. So I could assign this color to this particular shape, send it off to the printers, and they could match this color exactly to produce that same color by matching the inks appropriately. So essentially you're going to go through and you can either convert each one of these colors by clicking them, going up here to CMYK and adjusting the slider, or you can come down to the PMS colors and assign them some sort of specific color that way as well. So you're going to go through and start assigning colors to each one of these shapes. And then in part 2 of the videos, we're going to start applying some textures within here as well.